Today, you're going to hear a heartbreaking story about a silent man whose world changes when a young girl breaks through his barriers. Before this moving story, tell us where you're listening from and leave a like if you enjoy it, or comment. In the quiet suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, where autumn leaves painted the streets in hues of amber and crimson, lived 45-year-old Thomas Harrington. Once a celebrated literature professor at Harvard University, Thomas had retreated into a world of silence following a devastating car accident 3 years ago that claimed the life of his wife, Eleanor, and left their teenage son, James, with severe injuries that eventually healed physically but not emotionally. The sprawling Victorian house that once echoed with laughter and animated discussions about Hemingway and Fitzgerald now stood eerily quiet. Thomas hadn't spoken a word since the funeral. Not to his colleagues who eventually stopped calling. Not to his neighbors who awkwardly avoided eye contact at the local grocery store. Not even to James, who had moved to California for college, partly to escape the suffocating silence of their home. The doctors called it selective mutism triggered by extreme trauma. Thomas understood their diagnosis but couldn't bring himself to care. Words had been his life, his passion, his career, his connection to the world. Now they seemed pointless, hollow echoes of a happiness he could never reclaim. On a particularly cold Tuesday in November, Thomas received a call from his sister, Catherine, who lived in Chicago with her husband and 3 children. She had been the only one who hadn't given up on him, calling weekly despite his one-word text responses. "Thomas, I've hired someone to help around the house," Catherine explained, her voice tinged with the familiar mixture of concern and exasperation. Her name is Lucia Martinez. She's from Guatemala originally, but has been in Boston for 15 years. She'll come 3 times a week to clean, cook, and just make sure you're okay. And before you try to refuse, it's already arranged. She starts tomorrow. Thomas wanted to protest, but couldn't find the energy. Besides, what would be the point? He simply texted okay and returned to staring at the rain-streaked window in his study, surrounded by books he no longer read and half-finished manuscripts he would never complete. Lucia arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. She was a petite woman in her early 40s with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Thomas had expected judgment or pity in her gaze, but found neither. She simply handed him a note introducing herself and explaining that sometime she would bring her 10-year-old daughter, Isabella, if school was out. Thomas nodded and retreated to his study, while Lucia began transforming the neglected house. By the end of the day, the dust that had settled like grief on every surface was gone. The refrigerator contained actual food instead of expired condiments. The laundry was done, folded, and put away. Thomas found himself both grateful and uncomfortable with these changes, as if Lucia was disturbing the carefully preserved museum of his former life. Weeks passed, and Thomas grew accustomed to Lucia's presence. She wasn't intrusive, didn't try to engage him in conversation, and seemed to understand his need for solitude. She left him notes about practical matters: electric bill on counter needs payment, or repairman coming Thursday for furnace. Thomas would respond with nods or brief written instructions. It was during Christmas break when Thomas first met Isabella. The schools were closed, and Lucia brought her daughter to work. Thomas heard them before he saw them. Isabella's excited chatter in a mixture of English and Spanish, and Lucia's gentle responses. Something about the girl's voice made Thomas pause at his study door instead of locking it as he usually did. Isabella was small for her age, with her mother's eyes and a bright red hat pulled over dark curls. When she spotted Thomas, she didn't display the awkward discomfort adults showed around him. Instead, she smiled brightly and said, "Hello, Mr. Harrington. I'm Isabella. Mom says you have more books than the library." Thomas felt something stir within him. Not enough to speak, but enough to nod and gestures toward his study, where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall. Isabella's eyes widened, and she looked at her mother questioningly. Lucia seemed surprised, but nodded permission. "She loves reading," Lucia explained softly, the first personal information she had shared with Thomas. "Her teachers say she's reading at a high school level already." Thomas led Isabella into his sanctuary, watching as she reverently approached the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of books that hadn't been touched in years. She pulled out a worn copy of Charlotte's Web and looked at Thomas with delight. "This is my favorite. Have you read it?" When Thomas nodded, she continued, "Isn't it sad but also happy? That's what I love about good books. They make you feel everything." For the first time in 3 years, Thomas felt an urge to respond verbally. The words formed in his mind but caught in his throat. Instead, he took a notebook from his desk and wrote. It was my son's favorite too. Isabella read his note and smiled softly. "Where is your son now?" "California." "College," Thomas wrote. "You must miss him," Isabella said, with the simple directness only children can manage. Thomas nodded, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. But somehow, in the presence of this perceptive child, the pain felt different, still present, but less suffocating. "You can borrow any book you like," Thomas wrote, surprising himself with the offer. From that day forward, whenever Isabella came with her mother, she would spend time in Thomas's study, reading quietly in the corner armchair or asking him questions about different books. Thomas would respond in writing, finding himself elaborating more than necessary, explaining literary concepts or historical contexts. Sometimes he would recommend a book, writing brief notes about why he thought she might enjoy it. One evening after they had left, Thomas found himself standing in front of his son's bedroom door. He hadn't entered the room since James left for college 2 years ago. With a trembling hand, he turned the knob and stepped inside. Everything remained untouched. The soccer trophies, the science fair ribbons, the photos of James and Eleanor that Thomas had been unable to look at. He sat on the edge of the bed, allowing memories to wash over him instead of pushing them away. The next morning, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He walked to the local coffee shop instead of making coffee at home. The barista did a double take when she saw him, but recovered quickly. "Professor Harrington, it's been ages." "The usual?" she asked, remembering his preference for dark roast, no room for cream. Thomas nodded, surprised she remembered him after all this time. As he waited for his coffee, he noticed the community bulletin board covered with flyers. One caught his eye. The local library was looking for volunteers for their children's reading program. "Are you enjoying our story? Tell us where you're watching our videos from. Leave your city in the comments and what stories you enjoy most. Suggest a story for us to tell next." When Lucia arrived later that day, Thomas handed her a note. "Does Isabella go to the library's reading program?" Lucia's expression clouded. She used to love it, but they had to cut back due to funding. Now they only have it once a month instead of weekly. Thomas nodded, tucking this information away. When Lucia and Isabella left that evening, he sat at his computer for the first time in months and began researching. By morning, he had drafted a proposal for the Harvard Department of English to partner with a local library for a community outreach program. Using his remaining connections, he emailed his former department chair, Professor Williams, who had reached out countless times over the years. The response came within hours. "Thomas, it's wonderful to hear from you. This proposal is exactly what we've been looking for. When can we meet to discuss details?" Thomas stared at the screen, the reality of what he'd initiated sinking in. A meeting would require him to leave his house, to be among colleagues, to communicate somehow. The anxiety that rose in his chest was nearly overwhelming. But then he thought of Isabella's love for books, of the other children who might benefit, and he found himself typing. Thursday, 2 p.m. The meeting was excruciating. Thomas brought a notepad and wrote his responses to questions, while Professor Williams and the library director discussed logistics. His former colleagues cast curious glances his way, but no one pressured him to speak. By the end of the hour, they had agreed on a framework. Harvard graduate students would conduct weekly reading sessions at the library, with Thomas serving as the program coordinator, a role that would allow him to contribute without requiring verbal communication. When Thomas told Isabella about the program through one of his notes, her excitement was palpable. "Can I help?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. "I can make signs, or help choose books, or read to the little kids." Thomas wrote that he would find a role for her, and the smile that lit up her face made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion, something close to purpose. The program launched in February, and Thomas forced himself to attend the first session, standing in the back of the children's section as graduate students read stories and led activities. Isabella flitted about, helping younger children find seats and passing out bookmarks she had made herself. Seeing her in this environment, surrounded by books and brimming with confidence, Thomas felt an unexpected pride. As the weeks passed, Thomas became more involved, selecting books for the program and occasionally sitting in the circle during story time. The children seemed unperturbed by his silence, accepting the graduate student's simple explanation that Mr. Harrington likes to listen more than talk. In March, Thomas received a text from James. "Dad, Professor Williams told me about the library program. That's really cool. I'm coming home for spring break next week. Is that okay?" Thomas stared at the message, heart pounding. He hadn't seen his son in over a year. Their last visit had been tense and brief, with James frustrated by his father's continued silence and Thomas unable to bridge the gap between them. With shaking fingers, he typed, "Yes," looking forward to it. When Thomas shared the news with Lucia and Isabella, the girl immediately asked, "Can I meet him? Does he like books too?" Thomas nodded, writing that James had been an avid reader before the accident, but had stopped afterward, focusing instead on computer science in college. Maybe he just needs to find the right book again, Isabella suggested with the optimism of youth. James arrived on a rainy Saturday, taller than Thomas remembered and with a new seriousness in his eyes. The initial reunion was awkward, with James filling the silence with nervous chatter about school and his roommates while Thomas nodded and tried to convey his feelings through expressions alone. "The house looks different," James commented, noticing the fresh paint in the hallway and the vase of flowers on the dining table, all Lucia's touches. "It feels alive again." Thomas gestured toward the kitchen where he had prepared lunch, another new development. They ate in relative silence until James finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Dad, are you ever going to speak again?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "The doctor said there's no physical reason why you can't. It's been 3 years, and I miss your voice. I miss our conversations." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his throat, the words forming but unable to emerge. He reached for his notepad and wrote, "I'm trying." James looked away, disappointment evident. "Yeah, okay. I know it's not your fault. It's just hard." The next day, Lucia and Isabella came as usual, despite it being Sunday. Thomas had asked them to come specifically to meet James. When Isabella learned who James was, she approached him without hesitation. "Your dad says you used to love reading too," she said, sitting next to him on the couch. "What was your favorite book?" James seemed taken aback by her directness, but answered, "The Hobbit. My dad used to read it to me every year around Christmas. He recommended that to me too." Isabella exclaimed. "He said it's an adventure on the outside, but really about finding bravery inside yourself." James looked surprised. "He wrote that to you?" Isabella nodded enthusiastically. "He writes me lots of things about books. He's helping me write my own story now. It's about a girl who finds a magic door in her school library." James glanced at Thomas with a new expression, something between confusion and hope. "Dad's helping you write a story?" "Well, I write it, and he gives me notes," Isabella explained. "He's very good at explaining when something doesn't make sense or when I need more description." Later, after Lucia and Isabella had gone home, James approached Thomas in his study. "That little girl really looks up to you," he said quietly. "She talks about you like you're still the same dad who used to help me with my English papers and debate the merits of different translations of the Iliad." Thomas felt tears pricking at his eyes. He wrote, "I'm not the same, but maybe I'm not completely gone either." James sat in the chair across from him. "I've been angry," he admitted, "at you for shutting down, at Mom for dying, at myself for leaving for college when maybe I should have stayed." He took a deep breath. "But seeing you with Isabella, it reminds me that we can connect with people in different ways. That maybe what matters isn't how we communicate, but that we try." Thomas reached out and grasped his son's hand, a gesture he hadn't made in years. The next few days brought a tentative renewal between father and son. James attended the library reading program, sitting beside Thomas and watching with newfound understanding as his father communicated through notes and gestures. He met Thomas's former colleagues, who shared stories of his father's impact on students over the years. James said as they walked home from the library, "I've been thinking about transferring to Boston University for my senior year. Finish closer to home." Thomas stopped walking, looking at his son with questioning eyes. "It's not just for you," James clarified. "I've realized I miss the East Coast. California's nice, but it doesn't feel like home. And BU has a good computer science program. Plus," he hesitated, "I'd like to get to know you again, Dad. The you that exists now, not the one I keep comparing to my memories." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in Eleanor's reading chair by the bedroom window, looking at the stars and thinking about second chances. About Isabella's unwavering acceptance of his silence. About James's willingness to rebuild their relationship despite the barriers between them. About Lucia's quiet support that had gradually brought life back into his home. The following Saturday, Isabella burst into the house with unusual excitement. "Mr. Harrington, my story won the school writing contest. The one you helped me with." Thomas smiled and gave her a thumbs up, genuinely pleased for her. "The prize is getting to read it at the school assembly next Friday," she continued, then looked down shyly. "Would you come? Mom can't because she has to work at her other job, and I'm kind of scared to read in front of everyone." Thomas felt panic rise at the thought of attending a school event filled with strangers, but the hope in Isabella's eyes made refusal impossible. He nodded, writing that he would be there to support her. "Thank you," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him in an impulsive hug that left Thomas frozen in surprise. It was the first time anyone had hugged him since Eleanor's funeral. When Friday arrived, Thomas found himself sitting uncomfortably in the elementary school auditorium, surrounded by parents he didn't know. James had come home for the weekend specifically to attend with him, a buffer against the social anxiety that threatened to overwhelm Thomas. "It's okay, Dad," James whispered as he noticed his father's white-knuckled grip on the chair. "We can leave right after Isabella's part if you need to." The principal announced the writing contest winners, calling Isabella to the stage for first place in the 5th grade category. She looked tiny behind the podium, her voice initially soft as she began reading her story about a girl who discovers a door to another world in her school library. But as she continued, her confidence grew, her words painting vivid images of adventure and discovery. Thomas listened, recognizing passages they had worked on together, places where he had suggested more descriptive language or a different approach to dialogue. Pride swelled in his chest, not just for her talent, but for her courage in sharing her work. When Isabella reached the climax of her story, she looked up from her paper and directly at Thomas. The girl realized that the real magic wasn't in the door or the world beyond it, she read. The real magic was in the stories themselves, in the way they connected people across time and space, in the way they helped her understand herself and others. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a breaking loose of emotions long suppressed. Beside him, James squeezed his hand, seeming to sense the change. After the assembly, they waited in the hallway for Isabella. When she spotted them, she ran over, clutching her certificate. "Did you like it?" she asked breathlessly. "I changed the ending like you suggested. It's better now, right?" Thomas nodded, feeling words rise in his throat, pressing to be released. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't push them back down. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse but audible. Isabella's eyes widened, and James inhaled sharply beside him. "For what?" Isabella asked softly, sensing the significance of the moment. Thomas swallowed hard, tears filling his eyes as he forced out 2 more words, "for stories." Isabella's face broke into a radiant smile as she realized what had happened. She took his hand in her small one and said simply, "That's what they're for." James was openly crying now, one hand covering his mouth in shock. "Dad," he managed, his voice cracking with emotion. Thomas turned to his son, years of unspoken grief and love filling the space between them. "James," he said, his voice stronger now. "I'm sorry." James shook his head, pulling his father into a fierce embrace. "You don't have to be sorry. You're here now. That's what matters." In the weeks that followed, Thomas's return to speech was gradual and often painful. Words didn't come easily after years of silence, and sometimes he retreated back into written communication when emotions overwhelmed him. But he kept trying, working with a speech therapist who specialized in selective mutism recovery. By summer, he had agreed to teach a single seminar at Harvard in the fall, a small, upper-level course on literature and trauma. James transferred to Boston University as planned, moving back into his old bedroom and bringing a new energy to the house with his late-night coding sessions and weekend visits from college friends. Lucia continued working for them, her relationship with Thomas evolving from employee to friend. Isabella became a regular fixture in their lives, joining them for Sunday dinners and continuing to seek Thomas's guidance on her writing. One evening in late August, as they all sat on the back porch watching fireflies illuminate the garden Lucia had planted, Thomas found himself thinking of Eleanor. For the first time, the memory didn't bring only pain, but also a bittersweet recognition of how she would have loved this moment. This unlikely family they had created from the fragments of trauma and loss. "I have something to say," Thomas announced, his voice still carrying the slight hesitation that marked his speech these days. Everyone turned to him expectantly. "3 years ago, I stopped speaking because words failed me. They couldn't express my grief or bring back what I'd lost." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But Isabella showed me that even when words fail, stories continue. They connect us. They heal us." Thomas finished, his voice still a little hoarse, but clear and resonant in the quiet evening air. James nodded, a profound understanding in his eyes. Lucia offered a gentle, knowing smile, and Isabella, ever perceptive, simply squeezed his hand, her small gesture speaking volumes. The fireflies continued their silent dance, mirroring the quiet hope that had finally settled over the Harrington household. The weeks that followed were a testament to the fragile but persistent nature of healing. Thomas's speech, though no longer absent, was a muscle he had to relearn to use. There were days when the words felt heavy, trapped behind a wall of old fear and grief. He would sometimes revert to notes, especially when overwhelmed or tired, but the difference was that now he could speak. He chose to speak, driven by a renewed sense of purpose and the quiet encouragement of his newfound family. His speech therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Evans, praised his progress, noting the remarkable shift from selective mutism to a deliberate, if sometimes hesitant, re-engagement with verbal communication. She emphasized that true recovery wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it, finding new ways to express the complex tapestry of his emotions. The seminar at Harvard, Literature and Trauma, Narratives of Resilience, became an unexpected anchor for Thomas. He had initially dreaded the return to academia, the scrutiny of his former colleagues, the expectation of his students. But the small, intimate class of graduate students proved to be his sanctuary. They were bright, empathetic, and genuinely interested in the intersection of literature and the human experience. Thomas found that discussing the works of authors who had grappled with loss and suffering, like Joan Didion or C.S. Lewis, allowed him to process his own journey in a detached yet deeply personal way. He would often begin lectures by writing key points on the whiteboard, then gradually transition to speaking, his voice gaining strength and confidence as he delved into the texts. His students, aware of his history, listened with a respect that transcended mere academic interest. They saw not just a professor, but a man who embodied the very resilience they were studying. James, meanwhile, settled into Boston University with a quiet determination. His computer science courses were demanding, but he found a new balance, often spending evenings in his old room, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating his face. He and Thomas began a new ritual: Sunday morning walks through the Arnold Arboretum, a sprawling botanical garden near their home. These walks were often punctuated by long silences, but they were comfortable silences filled with unspoken understanding. Sometimes, James would talk about his classes, his friends, or the latest tech innovations. Thomas would listen, interjecting with questions or observations, his voice growing steadier with each conversation. He learned about James's dreams, his anxieties, and the subtle ways he had matured since leaving for California. James, in turn, saw his father not as the silent, grieving figure he had left behind, but as a man slowly, painstakingly rebuilding his life. The library reading program flourished under Thomas's quiet guidance. Professor Williams, impressed by Thomas's dedication and the program's success, had secured additional funding, allowing for more frequent sessions and the expansion of outreach to other community centers. Thomas, though still preferring to work behind the scenes, found immense satisfaction in selecting books, organizing events, and seeing the joy on children's faces as they discovered the magic of stories. Isabella remained his most enthusiastic helper, her bright red hat a familiar sight among the bookshelves. She had become a confident reader and a natural leader among the younger children, often leading small group discussions or helping them choose their first chapter books. One crisp October afternoon, Thomas was in his study, preparing for his next Harvard seminar, when Isabella knocked softly on the open door. She held a thick notebook, its pages filled with her neat handwriting. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice a little more serious than usual. "I finished my story. The one about the girl and the magic door." Thomas put down his pen, his attention immediately captured. "That's wonderful, Isabella," he said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "May I read it?" She nodded, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of pride and apprehension. It's a little different from what we talked about. I added something." Thomas took the notebook, his fingers tracing the familiar lines of her script. He read, engrossed as the story unfolded. The young protagonist, Lily, still discovered the magical library door, but instead of simply exploring new worlds, she found herself encountering characters who had lost their voices, their stories trapped within them. Lily, through her own love of reading and her quiet empathy, helped them find their words again, not by forcing them, but by sharing her own stories, by listening, and by creating a safe space for their voices to emerge. As Thomas read the final pages, a particular passage caught his eye. Lily, now a little older, was reflecting on her journey. The girl realized that the real magic wasn't in the door or the world beyond it, she read. The real magic was in the stories themselves, in the way they connected people across time and space, in the way they helped her understand herself and others. Isabella had added a new layer to this. Lily, now a librarian herself, would tell children. Sometimes the hardest stories to tell are our own. But even when words fail us, the silence can be a space for new stories to grow. And sometimes all it takes is one person, one quiet moment, to help us find our voice again. Thomas closed the notebook, a lump forming in his throat. He looked at Isabella, her expectant gaze unwavering. "Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion, this is truly beautiful. It's profound. Do you like the new part?" she asked, a hopeful tremor in her voice. "I do," Thomas affirmed, his eyes glistening. "It's the most important part. It's about finding hope, even in the quietest places." He paused, then added, "It's about what you did for me." Isabella's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "You helped me write it, Mr. Harrington. You taught me that stories can do anything." That evening, Thomas shared Isabella's story with James and Lucia. James, usually reserved, was visibly moved. "She's really talented, Dad," he said, handing the notebook back to Thomas. "And she's right. Stories do connect us." Lucia, ever practical, suggested, perhaps she could submit it to a bigger contest? Or maybe we could print a few copies for the library program. Thomas considered this. "Perhaps," he mused. "But for now, I think it's a story that needs to be shared quietly with those who need to hear it most." The following spring, Thomas received an unexpected email from the dean of the English department at Harvard. They were offering him a full professorship, along with the directorship of a newly established Center for Narrative Healing. inspired by the success of the library program and Thomas's own journey. The offer was a recognition not just of his academic prowess, but of his unique understanding of the power of storytelling in overcoming trauma. He discussed it with James, who was now thriving at BU and considering a double major in computer science and literature. "It's a big step, Dad," James said, "but it feels right. It's what you were always meant to do." Lucia, when Thomas told her, simply smiled. "You have found your voice again, Thomas. It is good that you share it." Isabella, now 11, was the most excited. "You'll be like a real-life character, Mr. Harrington, helping people with stories." Thomas accepted the offer. His return to Harvard was met with quiet admiration. He no longer felt the suffocating weight of expectation, but rather a sense of purpose. He taught, he wrote, and he continued to oversee the library program, which now served as a model for similar initiatives across the city. The Victorian house, once a monument to grief, was now a home filled with a different kind of echo. The murmur of conversations, the rustle of turning pages, the occasional burst of laughter from James and his friends, and the quiet, steady presence of Lucia and Isabella. The garden Lucia had planted bloomed with vibrant colors, a living testament to growth and renewal. One warm summer evening, a year after he had first broken his silence, Thomas sat on the back porch with James, Lucia, and Isabella. The fireflies were out again, their tiny lights blinking in the twilight. Thomas held a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, a book that had once belonged to Eleanor and then to James, and which Isabella had now claimed as her own. "You know," Thomas began, his voice now strong and clear, "I used to think words had failed me, that they were inadequate to express the depth of my pain, the enormity of my loss." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Isabella. "But Isabella taught me something profound. She showed me that words don't just express what is. They create what can be. They build bridges, they mend broken pieces, and they carry hope." He paused, a gentle smile playing on his lips. And sometimes the most powerful words are the ones we find after a long silence. James reached over and clapped his father on the shoulder, a gesture of deep affection. "You've taught us all a lot, Dad." Lucia nodded, her eyes soft. "Life is a story, Thomas, and yours is still being written." Isabella, ever the pragmatist, looked up at him. "So what's the next chapter, Mr. Harrington?" Thomas looked out at the fireflies, then back at the faces of the people who had helped him reclaim his life. "The next chapter," he said, his voice filled with a quiet joy, "is about living it fully and completely, and about sharing the stories that connect us all." He opened Charlotte's Web to a random page and began to read aloud, his voice weaving a familiar tale into the fabric of their new, shared reality. The words flowed effortlessly, a testament to a voice found, a life reclaimed, and the enduring power of human connection. The silence was gone, replaced by the comforting sound of a story being told, a story that was, in its own way, just beginning.